Although there seems to have been a conscious choice to brand this surge of protests as a leaderless movement, individuals, political parties, and organizations are giving this movement its direction. And U.S. officials and organizations are openly colluding with this opposition. At the center of this controversy is a man named Jimmy Lai. His media company owns one of Hong Kong's most widely read publications, Apple Daily. As protests were heating up this summer, Lai went to Washington, D.C. and met with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. He was also hosted by the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a neoconservative think tank that hosts a board of advisors that include 2 former CIA directors. Then in August, Lai was seen meeting in Hong Kong with a man named Christian Whiten, who worked at the U.S. State Department under both the Bush and Trump administrations. Here's Whiten on a podcast later that month.
Causing this crisis for the Chinese Communist Party, for the government, at a time when we're, frankly, at a difficult point in negotiations. This is good for U.S. national interest.
Also present at this meeting was Mark Simon, Jimmy Lai's so-called right-hand man, who's an ex-Navy SEAL with ties to the CIA, although he says he's not a spy. Another curious figure in the anti-government movement is Martin Lee, who is present at this August meeting as well. He's the founding chairman of Hong Kong's Democratic Party, the largest pan-democratic party, the clique of political parties in Hong Kong that's been called anti-China.
Their policy basically is anti-China, and they do things which are really hurtful to the overall public interest of Hong Kong.
The Pan-Democrats would go on to win 7 in 10 votes that November in Hong Kong's local elections, but Beijing says that the opposition and its young agitators were stopping people from going to the ballot box. Martin Lee's connections to Washington go back decades. As the current protest movement was heating up, Lee also took a Washington and met with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Lee is the recipient of a number of awards from U.S. institutions, including a 1997 Democracy Award from the National Endowment for Democracy. Although the NED is technically an NGO, it has received millions of dollars from the U.S. State Department. And critics of the NED point to the fact that one of its former presidents said it was created to continue the work of the CIA without the CIA's stigma. Additionally, NED co-founder Alan Weinstein admitted that a lot of what the endowment does today was done covertly in the past by the CIA. I asked Lee about his party's alleged ties to the U.S. government.
We have been very careful. We don't take overseas donations because that's not allowed with any foreign political party or political group.
It may be illegal for a party to take money from a foreign government, but from a foreign non-governmental organization, that's another story.
That's not illegal, definitely. There are gray areas, An NGO, giving money in the cause of promoting democracy, there's nothing we can do about it.
There's also nothing to be done about donations from individuals. Individuals like Jimmy Lai, who donated to the Hong Kong Pan-Democratic Camp to the tune of millions. Then there's Joshua Wong, who appears in the press as a leader of this protest movement. Wong became the face of the anti-China movement in Hong Kong several years ago, and both he and Martin Lee have been honored by Freedom House, a subsidiary of the NED. Wong has met with Nancy Pelosi, Marco Rubio, and was most recently spotted meeting with a U.S. State Department official in July.
The National Endowment for Democracy takes U.S. taxpayer money. It literally funds foreign political parties. It gives training to people who end up, going on violent rampages through the country. It literally funds the salaries of foreign politicians. It brings them over to meet with Mike Pompeo. The National Endowment for Democracy, along with USAID, which is more closely tied to the U.S. government, they're completely and fully responsible for keeping these protests alive and keeping the lifeblood of money flowing through countries that the U.S. wants to overthrow.
It's quite curious that Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, a known conservative, has joined the protesters in Hong Kong. And what's even more curious is that in Mr. Cruz's own Texas, you've had police shoot black citizens in their homes, and yet we have not seen Senator Cruz join the massive protests against police misconduct against citizens that he's sworn to represent.
The U.S. is seeking to strike China through its soft underbelly. The U.S. is interested in destabilizing China because they believe that they'll get an advantage. They're afraid of the rise of China as a global power, the U.S. worldwide strategy is to prevent the rise of any rivals. And so we'll expend no limit of money to try to prevent that.
So why is the U.S. supporting an anti-government movement in Hong Kong? Well, maybe we should take a look at what's been actualized by this movement so far. Both the House and the Senate have approved their version of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Let's take a closer look at exactly what this law would do. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act claims to support the democratic aspirations of Hong Kongers. But what it really does is lay the groundwork for further U.S. sanctions and intervention. For one thing, the bill cites the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a treaty that China has yet to ratify. That means it's not legally binding under international law. The bill also cites Hong Kong Basic Law 45, the provision of Hong Kong's law that states that the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage. The United States says it wants Hong Kong to follow Basic Law 45. But any examination of Basic Law 45 reveals that implementing such universal suffrage should be done in light of the actual situation in Hong Kong. Still, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act threatens to punish China if it doesn't accelerate this timeline. The bill also threatens sanctions if Hong Kong does follow Hong Kong Basic Law. It says the U.S. will sanction Hong Kong if the Hong Kong government enacts a new law regarding national security pursuant to Article 23 of Basic Law. Article 23 of Basic Law gives Hong Kong the authority to prohibit acts of treason and subversion against China. It also prevents foreign police from conducting political activities and Hong Kong political parties from establishing ties with foreign political parties. Additionally, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act mandates the president to make a list of people for the U.S. to blacklist from entering the country. It gives the U.S. the authority to seize the assets of anyone on this list, Chinese or otherwise. And anyone who tries to get around the U.S. confiscating their possessions could be fined by up to $1 million. It's for this reason the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act has been called a money grab. What's more, the bill states that protesters in Hong Kong won't have any problems getting U.S. visas, regardless of what crimes may have been committed. Why is Congress proactively informing Hong Kong citizens that they could get a U.S. visa regardless of what crimes have been committed? Why is Congress trying to punish China for violating a treaty that isn't legally binding, and Hong Kong for enacting its own laws? Why is this bill trying to force China to accelerate its own timeline for granting Hong Kong universal suffrage when no timeline is provided by Hong Kong Basic Law? And why does Congress want to allow foreign influence in Hong Kong?
What is the aim of this sanctions vote? It really is an effort to totally sabotage Hong Kong. Demonstrators, they're not demanding democracy. Imagine, they're demanding sanctions on their own city. Sanctions everywhere in the world is economic warfare, and it's strangulation. Why on earth would anyone in Hong Kong make a demand that sanctions be passed on Hong Kong? There is an agenda. They may not be aware. These are young people without a future, and that's because of what has been imposed on them from the West.
You know, in the late 90s, the U.S. passed the Iraq Freedom Act, the Syria Freedom Act, the Libya Liberation Act. What legislation like this is meant to do is to establish a baseline upon which to build until you get further and further down the road of U.S. intervention and sanctions.
The Chinese economy has been growing 3 times faster than the United States for the last 30 years. The standard of living of the average Chinese worker has been growing much, much faster than anything that the average American worker experiences. The Chinese have figured out how to do the thing that is the most urgent need of the people of this world, which is to stop being poor and to become comfortable and to have a modern industrial economy. They are doing that. They are the ascending power in the world. Everybody knows that, and that means they challenge the United States because our dominance, the dominance of the United States, which has been in existence roughly a century, is now heading down.
The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is now law. Beijing may soon send in troops to act as peacekeepers to make sure the city doesn't destroy itself. But in Hong Kong, tourists have disappeared. The city's economy is grinding to a halt. Against the backdrop of an unprecedented economic war between a now dominant United States and a rising China, Hong Kong's future hangs in the balance.